much to everyone who's in attendance. I think we have a few more people who have signed up that might be trickling in as the time progresses. But there's a vacuum going in the background. I've got like two naked babies, like all sorts of. Anyway, Mikey, go away, honey. Go away. Yeah, so thank you so much for joining, and we are very excited to welcome people from the Emergency and Protective Services Department here today to help us walk through what might be a way for us to support one another during emergencies. And I know everyone's been doing this, pretty informally, um, pretty informally already, but there's some new toolkits and protocols coming out from the City of Ottawa so that they might know how best to support you in your relationships and your efforts. So I really appreciate everyone coming out tonight. And I just want to mention that we're gathered here on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Councillor. And apologies for a 7 p.m. meeting time. I was messaging Lane before, like, don't let me do that next time. Let's push it to 7:30 so the kids are asleep. Okay, and a quick introduction of myself. I think I've met our council members, but I think that there's maybe some guests from the community associations here as well. So I'm Chelsea Walton. I work with Councillor Johnson on a wide range of issues, but responsible for monitoring the Emergency and Protective Services Committee, Emergency Preparedness and Protective Services Committee. I should probably figure out what to call it. As well as supporting our community association. So this is obviously an important priority for many people in our ward. I know that College Ward's been very hard hit in several of the past storms. So we just thought it would be a great opportunity to bring together leadership from our different community associations to be able to share about some of the resources that are available and just to start the conversation. Tonight's we're not gonna have all the information, all the pieces in place, but just kind of a jumping off point, hopefully that you can bring back to your association members and be able to share with them and continue planning from there. So maybe now I would like to take a moment to introduce city staff. So we've got Todd Piper and Chris Harbosh here from Public Safety. And Todd, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So good evening, everybody. Todd Piper. I'm the new program manager with the city's Office of Emergency Management. I joined the team at the end of February from the city manager's office, and so I've had quite the introduction to the team with the POTUS visit, the ice storms, the spring flooding, and so on and so forth. So we finally got to a point where I feel like we're able to get back to more of this type of work and the normal stuff that we actually enjoy doing. So yeah, just again want to say thank you very much to obviously Councillor Johnson and the team for having us, and obviously thank you to all of you for tuning in this evening and committing time to discuss emergency preparedness. So it's I feel a bit bittersweet about these conversations. I mean, it's good that we're having these conversations, but in the same token, it's I feel like the reason why we're having them is because we're seeing more of these events happen, and the severity of them and the duration of them start to get more severe. So we're having these kind of more by necessity. But again, glad to have everybody here, and with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague Chris Harbosh for his intro.
Thanks, Todd. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Harbosh. I'm an emergency management coordinator with the city's Office of Emergency Management. It's a role I've only been in since September, but I've been with the city for over 10 years now, most of my time with Ottawa Bylaw Services. So I bring a lot of frontline experience with me to the program. And like Todd said, one of the things that we're trying to do is make these, connections with community associations again, because went through a couple of years of not really being allowed to meet up and kind of spread this messaging. So we're looking forward to being able to reconnect with communities to talk about preparedness and get communities to start thinking about it at a community level. And that's what we're kind of here to discuss today.
Okay, that's great. So thank you both for making the time to be here. I know your teams have been very, very busy, and evening meetings can be a little bit of a challenge to accommodate. So we're very grateful to have you here. So just to go through our agenda really quickly so that everybody kind of understands the flow of the evening, we're going to start with a presentation by Chris around the City of Ottawa's Emergency Preparedness Community Toolkit. And then I am going to present just kind of a very high level overview in terms of how to, kind of identify assets within your neighborhood that might be helpful during, like, in preparation for an emergency, and highlighting some of the resources and a couple of models that are existing in the community to be able to help you to launch and move forward with this conversation. So, Chris, if you want to go ahead and present your slides, that would be excellent. You're on
Thanks.
mute.
Yep.
Yeah,
I was just about to realize I was doing that. Let me just get myself set up here.
Sure.
All right. We should be in screen share mode. Can everyone see the presentation?
Yeah, you're good.
Perfect.
You're good.
Okay, great. So like it's been said, we're here to talk about the Community Emergency Toolkit, which we released online earlier this year. The toolkit was developed to help strengthen Ottawa's resiliency during an emergency situation by empowering local organizations and community associations to develop their own emergency plans and think about what they can do before, during, and after an emergency that will help their communities as well as the services responding to the emergency. So instead of going through the whole toolkit, I've taken some of the content out and I'll go through it so you have an idea of what's in it. It's not a long document. It's only about 10 to 12 pages online, but it has a lot of great information. And I'm also going to take the opportunity just to talk about preparedness. I'm going to borrow some content from our Are You Ready program, which is our personal emergency preparedness program. But personal emergency preparedness has a lot of great tips and practices that can translate to the community level. So I always like to start presentations off with this picture, just to kind of put into perspective how large Ottawa actually is. So we've got just under 2,800 square kilometers of city to look after. And as you can see from this picture, a lot of the other major cities around Canada fit snugly right into Ottawa. So we have a very large geographical area to look after when we're considering our emergency planning in the city. And these areas are so spread out that they're often affected by different hazards. So when it comes to emergency planning, there are really 3 simple steps. That's knowing the risks, making a plan, and getting a kit. So knowing the risks means ensuring that you have an idea of what disasters are possible in your area and in areas that you travel to. Emergencies can happen at anywhere or anytime, even when you're traveling. Step 2 is to make a plan, which is to sit down with your loved ones, your family members, your friends, and talk over what you would do, where you would meet, how you might escape, and what you may need to bring with you during an emergency. Emergencies tend to happen when our families are scattered around the city. And then step 3 is to get a kit. Having a ready to go kit for your house and car that will sustain you for up to 72 hours is really essential. And we'll go through the contents a little bit of each of these steps. But I'll just take a quick second to draw attention to the picture there. So these are our Are You Ready pamphlets. Now, if we were in person, I would have a collection of these to hand out to everybody. But these contain a lot of excellent information, about preparedness, about developing an emergency plan. They have a lot of great checklists in them that you can use when you're developing these plans. And like I said, a lot of these ideas and tips that are in there translate to the community level, as well as being meant for families and individuals. So before you begin developing an emergency plan, you have to take a few moments to consider the possible emergency situations or potential disasters that you could face. These are situations and events that could impact you or your family or your neighborhood or your community. And like I mentioned, it's important to recognize that not all areas of the city are prone to the same hazards. So you need to think about which ones your community is at risk at. So when it comes to identifying these hazards and risks, the city undertakes a process every 3 years called HIRA, or Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment. We've identified over 50 hazards in the city that we try to prepare for. We assess each one by looking at the probability or likelihood of them occurring, consequence or impact on service areas, and as well as things like risk mitigation that is currently in place, our response capability. And the idea is that we can measure our ability to respond to these hazards, as well as, again, their likelihood of occurring, so that we can properly prepare for them. So these ones that are on the screen don't necessarily represent the top 10 or 12 that are going to happen in Ottawa, but there's certainly ones that have occurred at some point, likely. We can look at most of these and think of some recent example of these hazards. So these are things that we're trying to think about before the emergency so that we can properly prepare. Step 2 in preparedness is making a plan. So these, making an emergency plan is really important. It's really important to have this in place ahead of time. That way, during an emergency, when emotions are running high, it affects our ability to think clearly. So having a good plan put in place is really essential to your ability to make it through an emergency. So a good plan would have something like emergency communications, which would be how to communicate during an emergency with your family and loved ones. That could include something like having an out-of-town contact who won't be affected by the emergency, and making sure that you have emergency contacts in your plan and that your family has copies of the emergency contacts. And if you have kids who go to school, making sure the schools have copies of those emergency contacts. These are all things about emergency communications during an actual situation. Having a predetermined meeting place away from your home will save time. Like I mentioned, emergencies tend to happen when our families are spread out across the city, not in the same place. So having a meeting place predetermined ahead of time, that could be your house, it could be a relative's house. It's really important to have these things so that your family knows where to go and where to meet up during an emergency, especially if communications have been affected. You also want to make sure that you consider arrangements for pets when you're doing your planning. Not everywhere that you might try to go for refuge if you have to evacuate will allow you to have pets. So make sure you include that in your planning. You also want to consider community emergency plans that may already exist or that you're already a part of. If you live in a retirement residence or an apartment, or you go to school, you go to work, these institutions should have an emergency plan. And if they have one, you likely have a role in it. And, a very easy example is everyone's, I'm sure, been a part of a fire drill at some point. You have a role during a fire drill. It's knowing where to go, how to evacuate. It's a good example of a community emergency plan that could already be in place for you. And of course, you want to consider additional health needs that your family members may have, include it in your plan. That would include, planning for up to 72 hours of emergency prescription, writing your health card numbers down. If you have walkers or oxygen tanks, making sure that you are considering those things when you are putting a plan together. And then step 3 is to get a kit. So really there are 3 types of emergency kits that you'd want to prepare and ahead of time. So that would be a grab and go kit, which is something you can pick up quickly and go on the way. You will want something like smaller bottles of water, lighter forms of food, basically anything in an easy to carry format. A shelter in place kit would be something that would be for a little bit of a longer period of time. You've been told that you have to leave your home and evacuate for up to several days. You don't know how long it could be. So you want to make sure you have enough that will get you through a couple of days. That could include larger bottles of water, more food, changes of clothes, extensive first aid kits, bedding even. These are all things that were essential for a kit. And then you want to have a vehicle kit. It's always good to have something in your car in case of an emergency. That include things like shovel and sand, extra clothing and shoes. Jumper cables are an obvious one. Gloves. These are things that you want to have in your car. We all have experienced Ottawa driving in the winter. You don't want to be stuck in a dead car in the middle of the winter in a freezing night without having something in your car to help you get through that. It's also a good idea to prepare personal emergency kits for your workplace. Keep some basic supplies in your desk, locker, or briefcase, non-perishable snacks, water, flashlights, cell phone chargers. These are some of the things that are really important. And I'll just touch on cell phone chargers again. This is something that time and time again in these recent situations where the power has been affected that we've seen come up. One of the most requested resources is charging stations for devices. So getting one of those small little portable chargers ahead of time that can power your device for a couple of days or a couple of hours even could be essential to you in an emergency situation. So that's a very abridged version of how to develop a personal emergency plan. Like I said, we have that Are You Ready program with a lot of amazing resources online to help you get through that. We also do Are You Ready presentations at community association meetings to talk about both the toolkit and preparedness as well. Again, a lot of great information. So we'll jump into the community toolkit now. So again, the toolkit was created to help large organized groups start thinking about preparedness and emergency planning at the community level. The toolkit contains information about hazards and risks, which I've already touched on a little bit, so I won't go through it again, but also contains some information about the different roles involved in emergency management and their responsibilities. So the examples here are site level response. So that could be the first responders or the experts with specialized training who oversee activities at an emergency site. The EOC is Ottawa's Emergency Operations Center, and that's where city staff and external partners coordinate resources, communications, and other response activities. And of course, community associations who can help get their members and residents of their community prepared for emergencies, as well as provide them with support during and after an emergency. So emergency management activities, that takes up a good portion of the toolkit, and it gets into some of the activities before, during, and after an emergency. So I'm going to get into each one of those a little bit separately here. So before an emergency, again, I've already talked about identifying risks and hazards that could affect your community, but you also want to consider who belongs to your community and identify local relationships that already exist. And you also want to encourage others who aren't involved in those things to get involved. Try to get more people to come to your meetings, host them regularly, have community barbecues, invite people into these local relationships. You also want to consider who in your community might be most vulnerable and may need assistance immediately during an emergency. That's something that we're always trying to think about when we're doing our emergency response during a situation, is who is most vulnerable right now and who can't help themselves. So, knowing that ahead of time is paramount to being able to respond properly. Consider gathering supplies that could help your community during an emergency, such as water, blankets, and generators. Having a stockpile of these things ahead of time will allow you to breathe easier during an emergency, knowing that you have something that you can fall back on in case those services have been affected. Talk about emergency preparedness at your community association meetings, or any meetings that you have. Make it a part of your agenda, just to talk about it, discuss people's roles, and just talk about preparedness. Make sure that everyone knows what to do to be prepared. It's important to just discuss these things before an emergency happens. All of these things come back to having an emergency plan and making sure your community is prepared and they understand their roles. So develop an emergency plan for your community, and it will do you wonders in an emergency situation. It will help everybody. So during a situation or an emergency, there are many things that members of the community can do to help both themselves and the responding emergency services. Some of these things include, activating your emergency plan, if you have one, of course, picking a leader to be a point of contact for city officials. During a situation, communications are extremely important. And oftentimes 311 and 911 can become overwhelmed with calls for requests for service or even just information. Everyone wants to help. Everyone wants to try to let the services know where to go, but that can overwhelm those services, and then it's hard to get information through. So picking a community leader to be a point of contact for city officials can really help streamline communications for a more effective response. Volunteer where possible to help with response activities. During an emergency situation, a good example is any flooding that occurs in Ottawa. We put out calls for requests for volunteers, trying to get as many people out to help putting sandbags out, as well as cleaning them up. Volunteering where you can to help really makes a huge difference. If safe to do so, work together to check on members, friends, and neighbors. So one of the things that we're working on right now is our ability to conduct wellness checks in the city, trying to coordinate and organize the services that are responsible, but we're also trying to encourage people to be able to check on each other. So we're going to be releasing some helpful information on how to conduct wellness checks, how to check on your neighbors, make sure they're okay. If there's someone on your street who might need to be checked on during an emergency situation, if the power is out, that's just going and knocking on their door and seeing if they're okay and finding out if you need to relay something to emergency services, right? And of course, work together to use your resources to help others. We've seen a lot of it during these power outages. We've heard the stories about neighbors with generators allowing multiple houses to hook their fridges up to them. these are really the strength of a community, a strong community, and having those relationships, right, with your neighbors, people on your street. You know, you don't know what they have that you might need during an emergency situation. And these last 2 points are really important because they really touch on the notion of neighbors helping neighbors, which is really a big part of what this toolkit is about trying to encourage people to help each other in the initial stages of an emergency, trying to encourage people to be able to help each other is really what it's all about, because that's the strength of a community. So of strong communities is the ability to know each other and help each other, oftentimes before even first responders are able to get there themselves. After an emergency, you know, it's you want to do a lot of follow-up, lessons learned. It's something that the city always does after every situation we go into. We're always going through review, figuring out how we can improve our response. So as a community association, you can encourage members of your community to attend town hall meetings and special information sessions to provide feedback to the city. You know, we take these sessions like this one right now, and we hear the questions at the end. We take these back, and we change our emergency planning or our ability to respond to emergencies based on that feedback. Learn about support services and how to access them. You know, encourage people to access those services, and of course, review and update your emergency plan. You know, these are all important things that you can do after an emergency to help you be prepared for the next one. One thing I haven't mentioned that's in the toolkit are some additional training and resources listed at the end. You know, different organizations like Hydro or Enbridge, they have emergency management plans. They're listed online. We've linked to those. We've also linked to some different trainings that the province provides, some free emergency management training. I always encourage people to take first aid and CPR as well. You know, I can't speak enough to how just it makes you feel confident during a situation. And I can tell you that in over 10 years of being CPR certified, I've never had to use it, but you never know when you might need it, right? And so first aid and CPR training is a really excellent thing that you can also do to strengthen yourself and your community. Really all comes down to having a plan and not letting the next emergency be your exercise. The best protection in any emergency is being prepared. So, you know, when you're developing an emergency plan, don't wait for an emergency situation to see if it works. Make this a part of your community association meetings. Or like I said, if you have like a community barbecue, have a little emergency drill or something, you know, that you can get people involved in. You can make it fun for people to kind of be involved in, but the idea is you want to get people thinking about it and thinking about how to be prepared ahead of time. So that about wraps it up. I know I went through things pretty quickly. We're happy to take questions here. Got my contact information as well as Todd's here, but I'll also just plug the Are You Ready program. Are You Ready is a program that our department manages. I've gone through some of the preparedness materials available already, but you can send an email to this. You can ask questions about preparedness. You can make requests for community presentations. You can make requests for those pamphlets that I showed. You know, we get a lot of requests for those. We're happy to give them out to people for you to hand out at your community association meetings. They're an excellent resource, and we're happy to share that. So that about does it for me. And thanks everyone for letting me talk, and happy to take questions at this time if there are any.
So feel free. Thank you very much, Chris, for that presentation. That was wonderful. I'm actually going to suggest, because my presentation is quite brief, so I'd like to maybe go through that as well, and then we'll do questions afterwards, because if there aren't a ton of questions, then, you know, you two can kind of go on with your night, and we can quickly chat about if there's any local community association issues. And I just wanted to make a comment that I found really interesting. It is that the introduction to the community toolkit was really focused on like personal preparedness. And this is something that's come up in my conversations with Chris, right? Like, you know, even for those of us that are more community minded and are you want to give back to our neighbors and be involved, the most important first step that you can take is making sure that you and your family are ready, right? Because if you're in a crisis or you don't have what you need, obviously it's going to impact your ability to show up for your neighbors. So just something interesting to think about. I know we all hear about the importance of a toolkit. I think very many of us take for granted the importance of actually having one in place. And the counselor and I were at it was actually an AGM in City View not too long ago, and staff from Hydro Ottawa were there. And they were saying, the reality is with changing climate and aging infrastructure, like these storms are not going to be infrequent, right? Like the frequency is going to increase. You must be prepared to go 72 hours without hydro. Like we are doing what we can. We're trying to harden the infrastructure, but the reality is just that. So I think it's an important message for all of us. And that's something too that community association leaders can bring back to your people, to dwell on the importance of like being prepared at home. So having said that, I will jump into, just give me 1 second here, sharing this presentation. And again, I'm not an emergency preparedness expert. This is really, that's right. Yeah. This is really just a kind of a jumping off point that I wanted to look at. Now let me see. Oh, it shows up with all my slides, eh? I'm also not a technical expert. Hold on. I don't know how to make it go full screen if I'm doing it through here. Okay, 1 sec. Worst case scenario, we're just gonna show it that way and we'll all survive. Let's go this. Okay, hold on. If I slide this over here. We're getting there.
I was just going to say, I opened it on another monitor and
Yeah,
that's
that's
exactly.
exactly what I'm gonna do. There we go. Okay. So looking at, I know Margot had some really good questions about like, this is good information. How do we get started? So I just wanted to pull together a couple of resources and some ideas for conversations that you can have with your community association to begin imagining what your emergency preparedness plan might look like for your community. So there is a little bit of repetition with the material that was shared by Chris, but that's okay. We'll go through it quite quickly and then we can ask questions. So the first important component is like the people, right? So that's what we were saying earlier is community associations really add so much value because they know their neighbors, right? They know the people that are living within their communities. So the city has a plan. It has the infrastructure. We have the emergency response, but it would be impossible to know how to target those resources effectively without neighbors knowing neighbors, right? So the most important thing that you can do in advance as an association, I think one of them is just generating a list of like people that might be willing to help out, right? Looking at within your association, who is showing up, right? Like what are your skills and your experience? What do you have to lend? So maybe you have somebody with a communications background that can take the lead on like writing out the plan in a plain language structure or sending out the updates on a regular basis during an emergency, but trying to piece together how to best utilize your people in order to serve the community. And then the second part about that, knowing your community, is knowing who might need help. So like Chris was saying, if it's safe and you're comfortable to be able to do it, conducting a wellness check, it might seem very intimidating, but it's actually just, a matter of knocking on your neighbor's door and asking, are you okay? Do you need anything? Right. And I think the really great part about community associations is that you know your neighbors, and maybe the person 4 doors down that's living on their own, and could maybe just use a quick check-in to make sure that they're okay. And within the role of a wellness check, it's not your responsibility to provide any kind of, service or emergency aid or anything like that. The resources are there. You can call 311 if that person needs help. If they need emergency assistance, you call 911. It's really just building those connections where they're needed, and that's a really important piece that associations are able to play. So the next thing for members to consider, or as a group, if you're building a plan, is looking at like what local facilities might you have. So I know some of your associations are very fortunate and you've got community buildings. And during the last storm, we were able to use those to serve food to people that were without power. So looking at like what resources there are, sometimes our office has been contacted even by different churches within the neighborhoods that are saying, you know what, like we're really fortunate. I don't know what our location is on the grid, but we never lose power and we're huge. If there's an emergency and people need a place to come charge their phones and warm up, like how can we make ourselves available? So um, part of this kind of, I'll call it like an asset mapping exercise, is just looking at like what resources do you have within your community already? Do you have a local business that steps up, right? That like sponsors the kids' barbecues and sports teams and shows up at the park when there's a family fun day or whatever. Maybe you want to like start to build a relationship with them. And it's not that you have to do the work of the city, like there is an infrastructure system in place to respond to emergencies, but knowing your own local community and being able to have the contacts and make those connections quickly is really, really important in emergencies. And then I kind of skipped over recreation centers. So the city is investing pretty significant funding into putting in generators within like strategically placed facilities across the city. So as an association, it would be helpful to know like, okay, which one's the closest to me? Because there's a chance that the power is going to go out and you're also going to lose like access to the internet or data. But to know that like, I know that this facility has a generator, it might be helpful to be able to better plan. The next thing to consider when you're looking at how you might develop a plan is your social infrastructure. So that's looking at like, do you have volunteer service groups? I mean, you've got your community association made up of very enthusiastic neighbors, which is wonderful. But you might also have like a local Rotary Club or Lions Club or like Bell's Corners has a community garden, like groups of individuals that are, you know, kind of community oriented and present in the neighborhood. Always helpful to kind of build bridges with those people, same as like the BIAs, might provide like a streamlined contact process as well for your local business community. Other community associations, that's one of the benefits of bringing everybody together for the Ward 8 council meetings, is that you all have each other's contact information. So, you know what, in some instances, like in most instances, it's Bell's Corners that loses power. But maybe Bel Air is just fine. And you can kind of support each other, right? And make sure that the messaging is being shared and mobilized, like not even just within your neighborhood, but within the broader community. And then I kind of skipped over it, but it doesn't hurt to take stock of your social service organizations as well. Some communities have local community health centers or resource centers, libraries, things like that, that could play a valuable role in an emergency situation. Communication. So this is something we've talked about as an office within the counselor's office in quite a bit of detail. So first of all, like how are you gathering your information? So some of the best sources for information in an emergency, if it's a prolonged power outage, the Hydro Ottawa outage map. It's not 100% accurate. There are upgrades to come, but it is the most current information that's out there. So even if you're contacting the counselor's office and saying, hey, when's my power going to be restored, or looking for answers, often that's where people are referring to when they're providing that information. So if you can look yourself, also if you have an outage and it doesn't show up on the map, it's very helpful if you can submit that outage to Hydro Ottawa, because sometimes there's little micro outages and that's helpful information for them to have. The City of Ottawa provides regular updates during emergency situations. Obviously, they're sharing that with the media. The counselor's office, our role in an emergency is really to act as an intermediary, so to share that messaging of the city and to amplify it, as well as to share the information back that we're hearing from the community. So we're kind of in the middle, building a bridge. So if there's trends that you're seeing in your community, by all means, please contact us. I know during the ice storm, we also tried to reach out to each of our contacts from the different associations to ask, like, what are you seeing? What do things look like? You also want to have a plan for how you'll share information within your association. So whether you've got like a community Facebook page or an email blast, just an opportunity to share information quickly. And then how that information will be shared with the broader community. Okay. And here's just some questions to ask yourself if you're sitting down together to kind of develop a plan. So where is your community well resourced and what assets are your greatest strengths? So some communities maybe have a very active volunteer base, right? They've got a giant community association. Everybody shows up to all the meetings and they're ready to pitch in and they're very, well connected. That's a huge strength. Other communities might have more of that like physical or social infrastructure that we referred to, but taking an examination of that will better prepare you for developing a plan. And then looking at how could you build greater neighborhood resilience. So one of the things that Chris spoke to was, the importance of just building community and getting to know your neighbors. Like even if it's just those street barbecues or, a picnic in the park, like those community building activities are actually a really great way to start to develop a network. So it's kind of something that has multiple benefits, right? Like you're building community and hopefully you're having a really good time, but then you also hopefully have a closer knit network to respond to these situations. And then are there any assets that you want to add or build upon? So some of that obviously is more challenging to address. I'm sure everybody wishes that they had a recreation center with a generator a block away. That's not the reality. Sometimes we have to be a little bit creative and work with what we have, but sometimes there's influence there. So it's just important to consider. And then what might you need or want to know more about? So like was mentioned in the community toolkit, like maybe it's been a couple years since you've done a CPR course and you're not feeling comfortable with your skills. Maybe it's worth booking a group session for members from your association, or maybe like today, you're here to learn more about the city's emergency preparedness toolkit. So now jumping into some of the resources that are available. I know that I asked for if anybody had questions to be submitted by email. And a lot of the questions that came through were speaking to the demographic information for the different communities. So this is a wonderful tool. It's the Ottawa Neighborhood Study. And if you click into it, let me just drag this over here. You can actually search within each community and be able to identify, like it draws up tons and tons of data. So it looks at like, what are the demographics of the individuals that are living there? What are the incomes? What are the, it speaks to some of the social infrastructure in terms of services and libraries and transportation, all those kinds of things. So this is, and it's neighborhood specific, it's not ward specific. So this is a really great resource if you're trying to better understand the people that are living in your community, and the potential, strengths, resources, risks, all those kinds of conversations. And then these are examples. So I'm almost hesitant because these are really incredible examples. And I think that the risk of like, it's better to have a plan, even if it's a little bit more rudimentary and basic, than to hold off on doing that because it's overwhelming. These are examples of like quite well put together plans. So for example, the Fallow Fields Community Association emergency preparedness plan. This is available on their website, and I'll share this presentation with all the links afterwards. But it's really great. It speaks to like, what are the different roles and what is the process for reviewing this and how are neighbors going to support neighbors in an emergency? So it's a really, really wonderful example of emergency preparedness. But I want to preface that by saying like, it doesn't have to be so elaborate either, right? Like it's better to have even a more basic plan than to have no plan at all. And then West Carleton Disaster Relief, it's a little bit different because it's not a community association. They've been founded and they've responded to, significant flooding events, and tornadoes in West Carleton. But their website's a really good resource. Like, it provides some really great examples, and then they even have like a household disaster plan. So it would be interesting to cross-reference this with the resources that are available from the city as part of the emergency preparedness toolkit. It speaks to that, like, personal, emergency kit and evacuation plan and all those details. So I just included those kind of as an example of what's out there. And now I'm going to stop speaking because, again, like I said before, I'm actually not an expert in emergency preparedness. So I would love, I know that we're a rather small group because it's summertime and it's a beautiful evening, but if anybody has any questions for Todd or Chris, or has any comments, that would be, you're welcome to. You can just take yourself off mute and turn on your camera if you're comfortable, and go ahead and ask. Okay, Rob, did you have a question?
Yeah, not really a question, more just a comment that it has been very helpful, and it's definitely food for thought. It's definitely going to, form the nucleus for something we can form for our own neighborhood here. Well, I mean, we did get hit by the tornado whatever that was, 5-6 years ago. That knocked us out for about 5 days in Briar Green. The derecho knocked some of the houses out for about 4 or 5 days. So definitely a shortage of generators. I had one for the first one, then I loaned it out for the second one because I didn't need it. But definitely, pause for thought for a lot of individuals. And I've got a feeling it's just like, well, we dodged another one. And yeah, definitely I'm going to add this in our newsletters and make this a talking point for just, the very basics. You can pick up generators pretty dirt cheap. They don't take up a lot of room in the garage. And it's when you don't have it, you really wish you did. So no, I do thank you for this. It's been very, very helpful.
Absolutely. And just reading through some of the comments. So I see that there was reference to heat mapping. Was that your question, Harry?
Yeah, that was in that document that I had sent you before the meeting. I was looking at the stuff that the city of Toronto did in their community resilience to extreme weather crew study they did, and they really talked about being able to identify within a forward area to say, hey, this section here has got basically no trees. It's all concrete. So in the middle of the summer, if the power goes out, that's going to be like a super hot spot as compared to a much more rural area, which allows then the city to look and say, hey, where do we need to put resources? And for me, it was a great thing to look at in the Toronto stuff to say, oh, this is what they're looking at. And then when I started to look at Ottawa, I can map pretty well everything that I was looking at from the neighborhood study, but it was the heat one that I was concerned about. And you guys did pop that up as a reply. And, it allows for me to realize that Bel Air's really good. We have lots of green, but immediately to the south of us in Maryville, they're sitting in a heat sink, because so much of Maryville is built up commercial area with no trees, and so if the power goes out in the middle of the summer, they're going to cook, and overall, I must say I was quite impressed with the presentation from both you, Chris, and Peter, because I had submitted like 15 points to Chelsea, and I think I've crossed out every one of them as being addressed somewhere in one form or another. So excellent job.
Yeah, thanks, Harry, and Rob as well for the comments. And Harry, just to speak to the heat, it's something that we realize we've been fortunate in the last two power outages that we've had. We haven't really been in extreme temperature situations, but it is something that we're always thinking about. And when it comes to the heat, I can say that we're kind of exploring an initiative right now to have cooling stations, like misting stations, set up in different areas around the city in case we do get into a bit of a heat wave situation, so that we're a little bit able more to mitigate that in some way, right? So these are you're not the only one who's thinking about these things, is what I'm trying to say. And it's we're always considering it in our response and our planning, because like I said, we're well aware that we've been fortunate with some of those power outages that it hasn't been an extreme situation when it comes to heat or cold. So appreciate the comment.
Yeah. Yeah, after the last outage, sorry, am I on mute here? Yeah, no, after the last outage, when I did get a generator, I also added a new siphon hose to my arsenal as well, just so I can at least pull some fuel out of my get out of the gas tank in my car if we needed to run for hours on end.
Right, lessons learned, right? Every
Yeah.
situation is a learning opportunity, and it presents you with the ability to add something that you maybe hadn't thought of before, right? So it's always good to have a little bit of a silver lining with every situation and take it as an opportunity to expand your arsenal, as you said.
Yeah.
One thing I'll just chime in, and then sorry, I see the counselor has a question. Just wanted to mention, Rob, on your point about generators. Again, there's a big asterisk around what I'm about to say right now, so I'll start with that. The province did announce for community associations, and again, it's part of, I guess there's a number of buckets underneath it, but did announce funding for over 3 years of, I believe, $110 million. And one of the funding streams under that, I believe, is intended to provide a financial assistance to community associations with procuring materials that should assist with resiliency. And I believe it did even go as far as giving things like generators or those types of items as examples. The big asterisk is because whenever we've talked to Emergency Management Ontario about it, none of the specifics have been worked out in terms of, okay, well, how much is going to be allotted to that specific stream of that program? What's the eligibility criteria going to include? What are the allocations going to be? So there's, again, a lot of unknowns about that, but that is something I would certainly encourage everybody who's involved with community associations to pay close attention to, because anytime we can get financial resources to provide support to community associations who are often on the front lines is a win for us, obviously. And again, kind of like Chelsea was saying about the 72 hours. Obviously, we always kind of plan for what we hope is the worst case scenario. Hopefully, it doesn't take the city that long to get supports there. But I always tell people, I mean, if it's a more localized incident, such as what we saw with the spring flooding, it's a little bit easier for us to kind of assess the situation, determine what supports are needed, and to get the plan in place pretty quick. In comparison, where you look at the Duratio storm from last May, where again it's citywide, and if you think back to the map Chris had, like how big of an area that is. And also our telecommunications, our own communications channels being challenged too. That's when it can take a little bit longer for us to understand, okay, what exactly are we dealing with here? Where's the greatest need? Where do we need to prioritize supports? Like, it's a bit more, that's where you might get into those longer periods of needing that support. So yeah, again, would encourage everybody to get the kits and be prepared, and yeah, and to keep an eye out for that funding.
Yeah. And the other area that's a little more challenging to be prepared for is, we've been kind of lucky with the last few. It's been during relatively pleasant weather, but it's never a question of if, but when it's going to happen in the dead of winter for one reason or another. And I was lucky during the ice storm. I was living in the country. I had a wood stove. But if I didn't have that, that would have been a very, very long, it was a long 10 days as it was, but it would have been an impossibly long 10 days without a wood stove. So, I haven't fully winter-proofed my house yet, but I've got to somehow make sure the generator and neighbors are integrated for heat as well. Because we are going to get caught.
Yeah, and just to kind of sorry, Counselor, just before you speak there, when it comes to generators, like, we're also in the city undergoing a project to retrofit a lot of city facilities with generators. that don't have them now, so that those can be set up during emergency situations as respite centers or emergency support centers. And on that, we're also trying to grow our relationships with the school boards and religious groups. You know, Chelsea talked about facilities being available. We're trying to grow our relationships with those organizations so that we have many options during an emergency situation, right? We want to grow those options so that if we get into a situation where power's out and it's extreme cold, we can set up more than one center in an area for heating and charging and any service that that you might need. So those are just some of the projects that we're kind of working on in the background to make Ottawa more prepared overall.
Excellent.
Okay, Councillor, do you want to go ahead?
Well, nothing really specifically. Chris sort of scooped me there. So the one sort of hardening that's happening is Nepean Sportsplex. That's the most recent one that's closest to us. But we do have certain areas in College Ward that are closer or farther away to existing recreational facilities, which is what was being alluded to there. So we don't really have anything sort of in the Copeland Park, Bel Air proper immediate vicinity. There is the Pinecrest Rec Center, which has been used a few times. And we are trying to find something for Bell's Corners because they also don't have a building that's really adequate for longer outages with the requirements that you need for showers, et cetera. And their buildings will often go out. So trying to be strategic about what needs what and how soon is part of it. And then I also, just because I was jumped off there for a little bit, I'm not sure if we covered off what advocacy we've been doing with Hydro Ottawa for Ward 8. I don't imagine. But we, it's like the slowest moving relationship ever. But we're continuing to advocate for, increased tree maintenance. One of my campaign promises was to investigate some kind of subsidy program um, about for assisting people to maintain trees on private property on a more ongoing basis, because we have a lot of elderly folks with a lot of really mature trees that might be on fixed incomes, right? And these things just grow up around you and become really untenable. But maintaining trees on a regular basis can really help in these emergency situations to not have the same breakages or damages. So I'm still working on that. We're thinking maybe that we might be able to mirror the Snow Go Assist program, which is a program that supports seniors for snow clearing. So there might be some models within the city of Ottawa to help with that. And yeah, so to ask whether Hydro Ottawa needs to increase the trimming or increase the frequency of tree trimming cycles from 5 years to 3 years, because if they're delayed, then at least their delays are tighter than on a 5 year cycle. So just chipping away at that kind of piece. They are working on their outage map. They know that is a real struggle for people. But of course, because it's such a fluctuating situation, they don't always know how things will go. So they err on the side of offering an estimated restoration time versus no information, which we saw in the derecho, right? We had like no information for several days, or I can't remember how many days it was, but enough time that it made people very, it made us feel quite isolated. But to err on the side of more precise information that then changes also gets people a bit crabby. So they're kind of in a tough spot there, but we're continuing to work with them to try and find a happy balance. The other thing that came through recently legislatively is that the city of Ottawa will be undertaking account of all the buildings that don't have generators currently, because that was something that came up in the derecho as well. Um, and we do have some buildings like that in the Deerfields area, for example, the Maples, which is right on baseline. There's 6 floor, 8 floor buildings. low-rise buildings, maybe up to 9 stories, but I think they're 6 or 7. Anyway, they don't have generators, so of course the elevator goes down, and we have, some people who are isolated. So we did some visits there during the most recent ice storm, but the fire department here is very interested in at least having those mapped out so that they can maybe be a bit more strategic in how they deploy their limited resources. So, as Chris was saying, we do learn with every experience, and I've been very impressed by, my work with this team um, to continue to be curious, to continue to advocate for those who perhaps aren't able to or don't have the bandwidth to advocate for themselves. Like they really show that sort of conscientiousness and responsiveness to people who, are just trying to figure it out. So I just wanted to say thank you for those partnerships with you guys, and bring you up to speed on some more Ward 8 specific pieces of this.
Okay, thank you for that, Counselor. So I see that there was another link dropped into the chat by Chris around the provincial emergency preparedness page. And there was a question around funding sources, and like we're watching, we're watching very close. If there's funding available to local associations, we will be sure to share that information because we know that there's a need for it for sure. And I did add a quick note because during the ice storm, there were several incidents in College Ward where there was carbon monoxide concerns because generators were, being set up in the garage or even being set up like it out in front of the garage. But then it kind of creates an air tunnel, and you open the house to the door and it's sucked right in. So I think that could also be a very, not that, you have to be a firefighter trained on all the specialized, but even just sharing that information out to the community, or if you're out checking on your neighbor and you see like, oh, that's not what it's supposed to look like, that little education piece can be really important, right? It can save lives. And I think more and more we're going to see people like Rob that are now choosing to make the investment to get the generators, but maybe don't have experience using them. And I think that's another important function in terms of education that the associations could play. So Rob, did you have your hand up there before I started?
Yeah, I did. I added it to the comment point. I mean, we don't have a community center or anything like that in Briar Green. And, as we're mapping out areas, Briar Green Public School would probably benefit from a generator and using it as a potential rallying point. And I don't know if that would be cases similar, say in Leslie Park, Prendon Darlington, kind of the whole row here from Briar Green to, to Hunt Club Road, where the neighborhoods, there aren't a lot of community centers, but, if the OBE facilities could be part of the solution or part of the emergency preparedness plan.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's being explored right now with the Office of Emergency Management. Those conversations with the school boards are ongoing. Okay. Are there any other questions or comments or?
No,
Yeah,
I'll just raise mine that I just posted there. We found during the storm last June there that we had, because we were out for up to 6 days in our neighborhood, that we had people going, where's a spot where I can keep medication cool? I'm breastfeeding. I need my milk stored, and so our community association, we're trying to figure out, who's got maybe like a dedicated fridge with a generator that they'd be able to offer up and say, look, the next time it happens, I can store it for you, without them having to go all the way, to some other shelter, in the middle of an emergency.
That's a great point. It's a great point. And I can just offer a little personally, like my parents have, during both power outages, lost their power for pretty much the entire duration. So my dad isn't looking at like getting one of getting a generator that's hardwired to the house, but he is looking to get something that can power their freezer or their fridge for several days, right? So, getting a generator doesn't mean you have to get one of those expensive Generacs that is hardwired into your house. It could just be something that you're able to plug your fridge into for an extended period of time, right? So, and like I mentioned, we're again trying to improve our ability to provide power in a lot of different areas during a situation as well. And that generator plan for city facilities does include, I believe, a mobile generator that we can kind of shuffle around if we need to. So definitely a good point.
Can you confirm, do most like fire halls and stuff like that have an emergency generator?
I'd have
would
to. I would think
that
yes, but I'd
yeah.
have to follow up with our colleagues in Ottawa Fire. I don't know if some of those older stations have been retrofitted. I would assume that most of them are. They need their ability to respond during a power outage as well, but
Yeah.
can absolutely confirm with you and circle back and confirm on that one.
Yeah, because I'd like to just, if there's one thing that, if every fire hall could have a fridge where they could turn around and say, we will only store medical or, stuff that, mother's milk for babies. We're not going to store your T-bone steaks and stuff like this. But, that would be a great deal because the fire stations are pretty well scattered throughout the whole city, and it'd be nice to be able to say, we know one spot where, when you have medication that has to be kept cold, eye drops for people with glaucoma, once they're that medication goes warm, it's useless,
It's an excellent
And,
point. It's an excellent point.
Yeah, and the only other suggestion I could add to, and again, it's by no means a permanent fix or a long-term solution, but I know there are little things like if again you're concerned about it being a long-term outage, I think some people will take like a bowl with some cold water ahead of time and put ice cubes, for example, in there and store that in the fridge to try to keep the overall temperature of the fridge a little bit cooler. And there's little again, I guess tactics you can say that will help a little bit with that, but it's by no means a long-term fix. It's just kind of an interim solution for those shorter outages. But
I think one consideration that's a little bit of a challenge is that the city is always trying to balance like risk management and liability, right? So like in situations like that where it's like, oh, come bring your medication, but maybe you lost power 2 days ago and the outage map said it was going to be restored yesterday, and now you're going to put it in a city fridge and hope that it's okay, right? It's always, and the same with like there's a plan right now to review working with community associations, because I think the city realizes that community associations are an incredibly valuable partner and that we can really leverage that as a resource. But emergency situations are inherently risky, right? And so if the city's asking for support with responding, then there's risks associated with that that need to be managed and insurance implications. So I'm really glad the conversations are happening. But sometimes it's the solutions seem quite simple, but then when you actually look at it, it's a little bit more complicated to work through.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to give Bill a chance to ask a question because he's been waiting so patiently. You want to go ahead, Bill?
That's fine. I just wanted to echo, two things. I wanted to echo Rob's comment that lots of associations have very little in the way of infrastructure like buildings. Leslie Park being one of them, we have a little trailer to, manage the rink, and that's about it. So the availability of the school in the neighborhood would be a tremendous benefit, since that's really the only I would say civil building in the neighborhood of Leslie Park. But my actual question was, I wondered if anybody knew whether or not Hydro Ottawa has any program underway to try and put the overhead wires underground in the older parts of the city. Leslie Park being half underground and half not underground, I recognize that's an expensive proposition probably, and there'd be no one straightforward solution in various parts of the city. But that seems to me, in the long run, that's probably the way we have to go to significantly reduce the impact of ice storms and tornadoes knocking trees down on the wires. And I just wondered if Hydro Ottawa is doing anything in that regard, even if it's a 30-year plan or something.
So
I think it's something that they're always, sorry, Chelsea, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. You go.
I was just going to say, like, I think it's something that's always being considered, you know, especially as these events happen more often, right? It's, you touched on it though, it's such an expensive project to undertake, right? And that's really, I think, a big part of it. But, you know, as opportunities present themselves to improve the system, like they're always considering it. I don't know if there's any specific initiative right now to start that work, or to like a massive initiative to have like a 30-year plan or something. But you know, I see it all the time. I see it being discussed, and it comes up out of every power outage, right? So
Okay. Not
Yeah.
surprising.
The only thing I was going to add is, again, I think back, and I admittedly can't recall. I believe it was in response to the 2018 tornadoes. I know Bryce Conrad, the CEO of Hydro Ottawa, had went to council, and I think had got much that same question. And I believe his response at the time was that for new projects, I believe they're looking at it because it's much more cost feasible to consider it upfront. Obviously, at that time, I think where he was a little bit more hesitant was around, obviously, the retrofitting existing above ground lines. And he was also, I think, quick to caution too, and this is why I think it was in response to the tornadoes, was given the magnitude of what had happened. I think he had said at the time that whenever you have those big transmission stations that end up getting disrupted, like Maryville, you know, the bearing of wires won't necessarily in those instances save everybody. It's not the you know, panacea, if you will. So anyways, but yeah, like Chris said, I'm not aware of any long-term formal plan to retrofit or upgrade or bury the existing system. Councillor can certainly correct me if I'm mistaken in that regard, but that's just what I recall whenever Bryce was in front of council last time.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is along strategic corridors, and with some of the upgrades that they're doing around the Maryville station, there's going to be more buried under lines, or and more buildings. Like all of their transformers will be inside a building as opposed to exposed to the elements. So they are, as mentioned, you know, doing those strategically. But I think you're correct, Todd, that it would be. I think we're going to see probably some suggestions from Hydro Ottawa to increase our rates, even just to maintain our current levels of service, considering how expensive everything is getting without burying all the lines. So there will be obviously trade-offs to those types of investments. But, you know, I also, this is one of the questions that made me unpopular around the table, but I was wondering a little bit about, you know, the city of Ottawa takes about a $23 million annual dividend from Ottawa Hydro. And that's what they do every year. And we won't be receiving the full 23 million. I think it'll be closer to 20 million this year because of derecho repairs. So it's not like the dividend is protected. We still, as a city of Ottawa, can incur losses if damages are such that repairs require, you know, a greater investment. And so I was suggesting at our meeting with Hydro and the mayor, and I'll be sort of bringing it back around this summer. I've decided it will be a summer boulder up a hill, but just to say, like, should we maybe be looking at that a little bit more? Like, what could there be, you know, a one-time upfront, as you say, like capital investment on some strategic places if they wanted to keep back. You know, it would create a hole in our budget. I appreciate that. So it would create a budget pressure. But have we ever done sort of like a short-term pain for long-term gain analysis on what that dividend looks like? Because right now it funds other parts of the city budget. And so to me, it feels a little bit like a house of cards when you've got, you know, a weakness over here, but you're paying for it over there. I mean, that's how these things are done. But I would be interested in just knowing, in seeing an analysis on it. That's all, because I don't know if it's been looked at in a while. And I think everything at this time, if we are going to be seeing, you know, annual once every 100-year events, or twice annual once every 100-year events, it's going to get expensive. So I'm always curious to interrogate what kind of relationships we have with our institutions. Not to say that I have a better idea, but I think everything's worth a look. I was told by the CEO when I asked that question that I am the only counselor that has ever asked that question in the history of him being the CEO, because obviously the city of Ottawa wants that money to be able to spend on other priorities, where we shouldn't be in the habit of trying to give money back from a dividend. But that wasn't what I was advocating for either. I was just advocating for like a transparent analysis of the long-term costs to doing nothing or to keeping things the same. So I'm going to be bringing that around one more time over the summer and seeing if I can't get just a little bit of curiosity. I think the CEO obviously is curious with me. It's probably the other 24 members of, or 23 members of council and the mayor that are less curious, but I can't help but wonder.
Well, it would be interesting to know what $20 million would do in that regard. For the next 10 years, that's $200 million. What kind of an impact could they have in that regard? And,
yeah, I mean, maybe it's minimal. Like maybe it's chicken scratch, right? Maybe
yeah,
it's
maybe
totally
that's nothing. Maybe that's nothing.
But
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't know the business, so.
I was just going to say, I do remember there was an interesting stat that he had, or a couple interesting stats that were pulled out during that update, and I actually was able to find them here. Appreciating this is not the again, not the strategic or selective upgrading that kind of this group is talking about, but I know whenever people present, burying wires as being kind of the be all end all solution, what they said was that to bury the lines across the entire Hydro Ottawa territory would cost approximately $10 billion and take about 90 years to complete. So I think that's why they're looking at it more in terms of those, like as we get new projects, they're looking at that as a preferred option. And then of course, maybe those strategic upgrades where it makes sense. But anyways, I remember that stat coming up at council. It took me by surprise, so just thought I'd share it.
Yeah, and my only insight on that, I have a neighbor friend who had to reroute their backyard cabling wiring coming into the house for a swimming pool, and it cost something to the tune of $6,000 or $8,000.
Yeah.
So multiply that by how many tens of thousands of houses, that'll buy you a lot of generators, a lot of portable generators.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And we actually, Hydro Ottawa has a wonderful community-based presentation called Keeping Ottawa Connected, and they really get into the reality of the situation. So Lane and I attended in December, I think, and they were referencing the storms, and they were saying, like we have a proactive plan, a capital plan to try to harden the existing infrastructure, not to bury everything, but to make it more robust and more resilient to stand up to these storms. And they're like, and then we have a derecho, and like literally years of work is wiped out in an hour, right? So like as hard as they're trying and the resources are being invested and the energy, but like the message from that meeting was like, go home and prepare for 72 hours. If you're in a position to purchase a generator, it's probably not a bad idea. But that's a separate meeting, and we'd be happy to set that up if there's interest from your association members as well.
Okay.
We actually hosted them earlier this year, and it was quite enlightening when you look at what their priorities are. And in our newsletter to the community association, we pointed out that when you look at, we're not a major hospital, we're not a major this, we're not a that, etc. We ended up being basically at the bottom of the pile. And it's like I said, but be lucky, because if you're at that top of the pile, you're hurting much more than we are. We're an inconvenience. They are maybe life or death, so it puts it all in perspective. I have to go. Thank you very much, Lane. We'll talk later. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Harry.
Yeah. Thank you all for your time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming. And I'll send out an email that includes the link to the emergency preparedness toolkit, the little slide presentation that we put together, and as well as the couple links to like the Fallowfield Community Association, Geo Ottawa, which is an excellent resource as well. So you're welcome to bring that back to your groups, and hopefully this is just like the start of the conversation, right? And if you have questions, I saw Chris included the contact information for himself and the team. Like everybody at the city is within this group has been very accessible. So we're happy to connect you or just reach out directly. And Lane, I don't know, do you have anything you want to say before we log off? No? Okay, perfect. So thank you so much.
Right.
Thank you to Todd
you.
and Chris for joining us and for everybody for making the time.
Thank you
Thank you
for
for having-
your time.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely.
I know.
Okay, have a good night.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.